This time, we will talk about the early periods of literature. By the way, I'm Juarizo and I am one of the reporter. When we say early period of literature, these periods are spans of time in which literature shared intellectual, linguistic, religious, and artistic influences. In the Western tradition, the early periods of literary history are roughly as follows below. First is the classical period. Classical period is the Homeric or heroic period in 1200s to 800 BCE. So Greek legends are passed along orally, including Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey. This is the chaotic period of warrior, prince wandering, sea traders, and first pirates. The second in the classical period is the classical Greek period. It is in 800 to 200 BCE. It is the time that where Greek writers, philosophers such as Gorgias, Aesop, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Euripides, and Sophocles, the 5th century, in particular, is renowned as the Golden Age of Greece. This is the sophisticated period of the polis or individual city-state and early democracy. Some of the world's finest art, poetry, drama, architecture, and philosophy originate in Athens. The third is the classical Roman period. In the classical Roman period, it is the Greek cultures gives a way to Roman power when Rome conquers Greece in 146 CE. The Roman Republic was traditionally founded in 509 BCE, but it is limited in size until later. Playwrights of this time includes Plautus and Terence after nearly 500 years as the Republic under Caesar Augustus in 27 CE. This later period is known as the Roman Imperial period, where Roman writers include Ovid, Horace, and Virgil. Roman philosophers include Marcus Aurelius and Lucretius. Roman rhetoricians include Cicero and Quintilian. And the fourth one is the Patristic period in 7 CE to 455 CE. It is where the early Christians' writings appear, such as the Saint Augustine, Tertullian, Saint Cyprian, Saint Ambrose, and Saint Jerome. This is the period in which Saint Jerome first compiles the Bible when Christianity spread across Europe, and the Roman Empire suffered its dying convulsions. In this period, barbarians attacked Rome in 410 CE, and the city finally falls to them completely in 455 CE. The second in the early periods of literature is the medieval period. It is when the 455 CE to 1485 CE. In the medieval period, there are the Old English or Anglo-Saxon period. It is the 425 to 10 1006. The cold dark or the Old English or Anglo-Saxon is the cold Dark Ages. Occurs when Roman falls and barbarian tribes move into Europe. Frank Ostrogoths, Lombards, and the Goths settle in the ruins of Europe, and the Anglo-Saxon and the Jutes migrate to Britain, displacing native Celts into Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. Early Old English poems, such as Beowulf, The Wanderer, and The Seafarer, originated sometime late in Anglo-Saxon period. The, Co- the Carolingian or Renaissance emerges in Europe, and Central Europe texts include early medieval grammars, encyclopedia. In the Northern Europe, this period marks as the sitting Viking sagas. So the second is the Middle English period. It is when the time that Norman English armies invade and conquer England under William E. This marks the end of the Anglo-Saxon hierarchy and the emergence of the 12th century Renaissance. French chivalric romance such as work by Chrétien de Troyes and French fables such as the works of Marie de France and Juan de Meun spread in popularity. Abelard and other humanists produced great scholastic and theological works. The third is the late or high medieval period. This often tumultuous period is marked by the Middle English period of the Geoffrey Chaucer, the Gawain and Pearl-White, Wakefield Master, and the William Langland. Other writers include Italian French authors like Boccaccio, Petrarch, Dante, and Christian D. Um, Pisan. The third is the Renaissance and Reformation. When you say Renaissance and Reformation, it is the time that takes place in late 15th to 16th and early 17th century in the Britain, but somewhat earlier in Italy and southern Europe, somewhat later in northern Europe. The Renaissance period, it is the early Tudor period. This is the War Roses ends in England with Henry Tudor um, claiming the throne. Martin Luther's split with Rome marks the emergence of Protestantism, followed by Henry Anglican scheme, which creates the first Protestant church in England. Edmund Spencer is a sample poet. In the Renaissance period, there also a Elizabeth period, which is Queen Elizabeth saves England from the both Spanish invasion and eternal squabbles at home. Her reign is marked by the early works of Shakespeare, Marlowe, Kidd, and Sidney. And the next to Elizabeth period is the Jacobite period, when Shakespeare's later work, Amelia Lanier, Ben Jonson, and John Donne. And the next to the Jacobin period is the Caroline period. It is the John Milton, George Herbert, Robert Herrick, the sons of Ben, and others write during the reign of Charles the First and his Cavaliers or the Cavaliers poets. And the fifth one is the Commonwealth period or Puritan interregnum. It is under the Cromwell's Puritan dictatorship. John Milton continued to write, but we also find writers like Andrew Marvell and Sir Thomas Browne. And there is the later periods of literature. These periods are spans of time in which literature shared intellectual, linguistic, religious, and artistic influences in the Western tradition. The later periods of literary history as roughly as follows below. And the fourth one, we already tackled about the classical period, the medieval period. Now we will talk about the uh, and also the Renaissance period. Now we will talk about the Enlightenment or the Neoclassical period in 1660 to 1790. The Neoclassical refers to the increased influence of classical literature upon these centuries. The Neoclassical period is also called the Enlightenment due to the increased reverence for logic and disdain for superstition. The period is marked by the rise of deism, intellectual backlash against earlier Puritans, and Americans' revolution against England. In the Neoclassical period, there is the Restoration period. This period marks the British king's restoration to the throne after a long period of Puritan domination in England. Its symptoms include the dominance of French and classical influences on poetry and drama. Sample writers include John Dryden, John Locke, Sir William Temple, and Samuel Pepys, and Opera Ben in England. Abroad representative authors include Juarizo and Muller. And the next is the Augustan Age. This period is marked by the imitation of Virgil and Horace literature in English letters. The principal English writers include Addison, Steele, Swift, and Alexander Pope. Abroad, Voltaire is the dominant French writer. The next is the Age of Johnson. When you say the Age of Johnson, this period marks the transition towards the upcoming Romanticism. Through the period is still largely Neoclassical. Major writers include Dr. Samuel Johnson, Boswell, and Edward Gibbon, who represent the neoclassical tendencies, while writers like Robert Burns, Thomas Gray, Cowper, Grubbs show movement away from neoclassical ideal. In America, this period is called the colonial period. It includes colonial revolutionary writers like Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Paine. The, the next is the Romantic period. When we say Romantic period, it is Romantic poets write about the nature, imagination, and individuality in England. Some romantics include Coleridge, Blake Keats, and Shelley in Britain, and Johann von Goethe in Germany. In America, this period is called the transcend- Transcendental period. The Transcendentalists include Emerson, Thoreau, Gothic writers, overlap with the Romantic and Victorian periods. Writers of Gothic novels, the particular horror novels include Mary Shelley, Radcliffe, Monk Lewis, and Victorian like Bram Stoker in Britain. In America, Gothic writers include Poe and Hawthorne. Next is in the Romantic period is the Victorian period and the 19th century. So writing during the period of Queen Victoria reigns include sentimental novels. British writers include Elizabeth Browning, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Matthew Arnold, Robert Browning, Charles Dickens, this is Jane Austen, like the Rosettes and the William Morris, ideals and long for the mortality and medieval world. The end of the Victorian period is marked by intellectual movement of asceticism and the deductance in the writings of Walter Pater and Oscar Wilde in America. Naturalist writers like Stephen Crane flourished as the early free verse poets like Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. Next is the modern period, the postmodern period. When we say the modern period in Britain, modernist writers include Seamus Heaney, Dylan Thomas, Hayden, Virginia Woolf, and Wilfred Owen. In America, the modernist period includes Robert Frost and Flannery O'Connor, as well as the famous writers of the Lost Generation, also called the writers of the Jazz Age, such as Hemingway, Steinbeck, Fitzgerald, and Faulkner. The Harlem Renaissance marks the rise of black writers such as Baldwin and Allison. Realism is the dominant fashion, but the dissolution with the world wars led to a new experimentation. The last one is the postmodern period. When you say postmodern period, it is a one in 1945 onward. And T.S. Eliot, Morrison, Shaw, Beckles, Stopford, Fowles, Calvino, Ginsberg, Pencon, and other modern writers, poets, and playwrights experiment with metafiction and fragmented poetry. Multiculturalism leads increasing colonization of the non-Caucasian writers such as Langton, Hughes, Sandra Cisneros, and Zora Neale Harrison. Magic realists such as Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Luis Borges, Alejo Carpenter, Gunter Grass, and the Salman Rushdie flourish with surrealistic writing embroidered in convention of realism. So that is the early periods of literature, and my co-reporters will discuss also the other part of the early period of literature. Thank you.